Well, I hope everyone is enjoying their time back at school. We're starting lesson 1-2 today. And this is talking about exponents, which I mentioned in lesson 1-1 a little bit, and order of operations. Order of operations is key to success in algebra. It's very important that you really get order of operations down well. It's very easy to make mistakes, especially when you're talking about with exponents, and especially when we're talking about using parentheses and when you need to use the parentheses. So pay very close attention to those rules, and if you're having trouble with any of them, make sure you ask me for some help with how to figure out the differences as we're going through. So we're going to start talking with exponents. And there's a little bit of vocabulary that you just need to make sure you're familiar with. Most of you have probably heard this or seen this before, but we're going to do a quick review. If I had something like 2 to the 4th power, this 2 right here is called the base, which I think a lot of you know. The 4 is your exponent. And then this whole thing together, we sometimes refer to it as a power. Now, people tend to use this in different ways, but this is always the base. Sometimes people will say 2 to the 4th power. And so just be used to hearing that, but it's talking about your actual base and your exponent together. And the exponent is what you're talking about multiplying by itself however many times. And again, most of you probably know this, but as our example, if I had 2 to the 4th power, everyone write down what that should look like if I was to write it out. And everyone should have written down 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So you're multiplying 2 by itself 4 times. Now, I have noticed sometimes students will start with 2 times 2 as one of them, and they'll end up with 5. It's not 5th power, it's 4th power. So it's just 2 times 2, which is 4. 4 times 2, which is 8. 8 times 2, which is 16. So that simplified even further would be 16. So don't accidentally add a 5th one in there. Okay, let's talk about order of operations. Everyone should remember this, PEMDAS. Okay, you must be very, very careful about following everything we do in correct order of operations. So, quick review. Hopefully most of you remember what all of this stands for. P stands for parentheses. E stands for exponents. M, multiplication. D, division. A, addition. And S, subtraction. If you already knew this, you don't have to write those down, but it is really nice to just have one thing to refer to later. And you must follow in this order. It's so important because it completely changes what happens with a lot of these expressions and equations. So we're just going to go ahead and go into a couple examples of these so that you can try them, because I know you've done it before, and then we can walk through them in case you have any trouble with it. So example 1, this is simplify because it's going to be an expression, not an equation. 25 subtracting 8 times 2 plus 3 squared. Okay, the other way that they could have written this, 8, and then they could have had 2 in parentheses. When you have a number and a number side by side, but one of them is in parentheses, then you're just talking multiplication. It's another way that you'll see multiplication represented this year. So go ahead and try that. Hit pause, try it, and then as soon as you're done, hit play, and I'm going to go ahead and start walking through it right now. So I look here, parentheses, I have no parentheses, so I don't have to worry about that. Exponents, I do have an exponent, so that's going to be my first step. So I'm going to write 25 subtracting 8 times 2 plus, and now I'm going to simplify just this one part of my expression. Remember, this is not 3 times 2, it's 3 squared, 3 times 3, which is 9. Okay, now I go to my next step, multiplication. I do have multiplication in here. You need to be aware of the signs that are in front of these numbers. This is actually a -8 times a +2, so be aware of that. So again, now I'm going to go ahead and simplify that part. So I have 25, a -8 times a +2 is a -16 plus 9. Now I just have subtraction and addition left. Even though addition comes first here, once I have just addition or subtraction, it's not going to change my final answer there. So 25 subtracting 16 is going to be 9. 9 plus 9 is 18. And if you stop and look at that, if you were to just check it this way, a -16 plus 9 is 7, -7. And then you'd have 25 minus 7, 25 plus a -7, and that would be 18. So either way that would have worked. So we end up with 9 plus 9, and then the final simplified version of that is 18. Okay. Tomorrow you're going to get a lot of opportunity to practice this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time taking notes on it. If you need to add stuff into your notes later, you can. After tomorrow, you'll have a better feel for what you're having trouble with, and you can add your own notes. So you might want to leave a little bit of space, and we're going to go ahead and go into the next example. If you're having any trouble with order of operations, there's this great little, it's called Take Note, and it's on page 10 in your book. And it's a little chart that just helps you to look at following order of operations. So go ahead and refer to that also if you need help. Example 2 talks about evaluating. Evaluating, hopefully most of you remember this from last year, is basically taking some variable that they give you and plugging in a given number for that variable. So if I had something like 3a subtracting 2 cubed divided by b, for a equals 7 and b equals 4. Oops, sorry. When you go to evaluate, all you're going to do is take 7 and plug it in every time you see an A, and 4 and plug it in every time you see a B. And there can be more than one. Make sure if you're plugging in something like this is a product. So it's not the number 37. That's where it's multiplication. It's 3 times 7. So you need to go ahead and put parentheses around that 7 or a multiplication symbol between it when you go plug it in. So I have 3 times 7 subtracting 2 cubed divided by 4. And now I'm just going to simplify. Again, I need to follow order of operations. Now, it says parentheses first, but this is actually representing multiplication because there's nothing inside of those parentheses that needs to be simplified. So this is a multiplication. Don't get that confused with parentheses there. Okay, so no parentheses that I have to worry about right away. Exponents. I do have an exponent here. Now, this is where this gets really tricky and you need to be very aware of it. This negative sign is with that 2 one time. So I'm going to give you a little example over here on the left in a minute, but for right now, all you have to do when you go to simplify this is you bring down your 3 times 7, you bring down your subtraction sign, and now it's 2 times 2 times 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. So you bring down an 8 divided by 4. And now you look PEMDAS, so I did exponents, multiplication. So now I'm going to go ahead and multiply. So 3 times 7 is 21. Subtracting 8 divided by 4. Okay, you have to follow order of operations here. So I actually need to divide before I subtract. So 8 divided by 4 is going to be 2. So 21 subtracting 2, and then I get 19. If you had switched this and taken 21 subtracting 8 divided by 4, you'd have a completely different answer there. So it's really important you follow that order of operations. Okay, now, this is a key rule that if everyone can learn this in Chapter 1, it is going to save you so much trouble as we go throughout this year. It's so important to understand with order of operations and exponents. It's a really, really key rule that tends to confuse students all the time. So here's the difference. I'm going to put a double star next to it because it's really important you learn this. If I have a negative 2 squared, this actually means negative times 2 times 2. So if you want to think of it, that's almost like a negative 1 times 2 squared, which ends up being a negative 4. Or you can just remember it as the rule, like I said, there's no parentheses around this, so my negative just comes over, and then I square 2, which is 4. But if you're having trouble understanding why that's working, think about this as a negative 1 times 2 squared. Now, completely different if I have this, because now we're talking about this negative is included with that exponent. So now we're talking a negative times a negative, which is positive, 2 times 2, which is 4. So when we're looking at this, we actually have a negative 2 times a negative 2, which ends up being a positive 4. So the only time that you're ever going to look at these negatives with exponents is when there's parentheses around that whole piece. Otherwise, every single time you just bring the negative over with the answer and then find your exponent. This is so key. It's going to help you throughout the whole year if you can really remember that difference. So parentheses include my negative with that. Now, if I had a negative 2 to the third power, what you're going to notice here, negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, negative times negative times negative ends up giving you a negative anyway. 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. So when you have an odd exponent here and it's in parentheses, you're going to end up with a negative anyway. But it's these even ones that you have to be so careful with that difference. That's the most important part of exponents right there. Okay. Let's keep going. Example 3 we're going to skip because you're going to have a chance to work on it in class, and it's just a word problem that is application based on what we've already talked about and evaluating. So I don't think anyone's going to have much of a problem with it, and if you do, you can ask me in class. So we're going to go right to example 4. Example 4 asks us to simplify. So again, we know we're dealing with an expression, not an equation. 15 times the quantity 13 subtracting 7 divided by the quantity 8 subtracting 5. And I'm saying quantity because I've got something going on in parentheses. So when I use that word quantity, I'm talking about something that needs to be together, and the way that we hold stuff together there is by using parentheses. So if we're talking order of operations, again, you want to stop and think parentheses first, and I do have something I can do with my parentheses. So I'm going to go ahead and simplify both of those first. So I bring 15 down, 13 subtracting 7, you should have had 6, divided by 8 subtracting 5, and you should have had 3. Now, the reason I left parentheses around this is because I'm talking a product, multiplication. I could have also put a multiplication sign there. My preference is to use parentheses. Multiplication signs tend to get lost, and they're real small and hard to see, or they tend to look like decimals, or they tend to look like a variable, an x, if you're using the x that you learned originally. So that's why I tend to use parentheses. Okay, now you're looking at order of operations, and we have multiplication and division left, so we can go ahead and multiply. And 15 times 6 is 90. 90 divided by 3 is 30. So on your homework, I want you showing these steps, just like I'm doing. All right, let's try another evaluate. This is example 5. So again, evaluate, we're just going to plug stuff in and then simplify. This is a good exponent example, CD squared. For C equals 15 and D equals 12. So I keep my parentheses, plug in 15 for C, and I'm going to go ahead and use a decimal, or not a decimal, I'm sorry, a dot, but I'm going to make sure it doesn't look like a decimal, and 12 to show product, and that is going to be squared. So order of operations tells me that I need to use my parentheses before exponents. Because I have something in here I can multiply, I'm going to multiply that, then square it. So I multiply 15 times 12, and I get 180 squared. And I didn't need my parentheses here anymore because I have nothing else being multiplied and there's no negative. If there had been a negative here, I would need to keep that in parentheses so that I remember the rule we just talked about. But because I don't have a negative, I could have dropped my parentheses. I just wanted you to see it both ways. Now remember, this is not 180 times 2. It's 180 times 180. So when I actually multiply that out, and stuff like that, on a test you're not going to be able to use a calculator, but I don't mind if when you're doing your work, if you want to use a calculator for things like that. It just speeds up the process, and at this point in algebra, you should know how to multiply 180 times 180 if you were taking it on a test. So your final simplified number is 32,400. Now, there's a difference between this right here and this is that other key part that we've been talking about with those parentheses and exponents. It's so important that you're so careful about that rule. When I go to rewrite this, it's 15 times 12 squared. There aren't any parentheses here. So a very, very common mistake for algebra students to make here is multiply and then square. That's what we did here. But the reason that we did that is because it's in parentheses, and parentheses come before exponents. But if you look at order of operations here, this is multiplication. Exponents come before multiplication. So you need to multiply this, then multiply that times 15. So be extremely careful with this difference right there. That's another one that I would star if you would tend to make that mistake. So we have 12 times 12, which is 144. So this becomes 15 times 144. And you're going to notice that we're going to have a completely different solution here. And when we multiply that out, we have 2,160. So again, I don't mind if you're using a calculator, but I want to see this step. I want to see you write that step down. Okay, last example. Be very aware of that. This is example 6. 2. These some people call brackets, some people call them braces. It's meant to be a set of parentheses, but it's when you're using more than one set of parentheses in an equation or an expression. So what you do with these is you just work them out like parentheses, but you think working from the inside out. So you want to start on the inside parentheses and work your way out, and I'll show you what I mean here. So 13, and then we have a quantity of, 13 minus 7 squared divided by 3. So what this is saying is, okay, you've got these parentheses in here you're going to start with, and then you're going to work your way with order of operations within this other set of parentheses. And then once you're done, you're going to multiply that whole answer by 2. So that's kind of how the order of operations works there. So start inside, then simplify everything inside of here, and then include whatever's on the outside. So I'm going to bring my 2 down, and I'm going to go ahead and keep this that way for now. And then I have 13 subtracting 7, which is going to be 6. So I have 6 and squared divided by 3. So I have one set of parentheses gone. So in reality, you could actually have this as parentheses now, but it means the same thing. 2 parentheses, and now I'm simplifying in here. 6 times 6 is 36 divided by 3. And now I'm continuing to simplify within my parentheses first. And the reason I squared 6 was because it comes before division. So always follow that order of operations. Even though it came first, I only did that first because it was an exponent. So now I bring down my 2, and I have 36 divided by 3, which is 12. This becomes a multiplication, a product. And I simplify that, and I have 12 times 2, which is 24. You'll get an opportunity to work on more of these. So if you're not good at that yet, I strongly suggest you really practice some of those more difficult ones. And again, right here is going to be really important also. Okay, I'll see you in class tomorrow.